We need employees who are more cooperative. The words echoed in the sterile silence of the conference room, each syllable a perfectly polished stone dropped into the placid water of my professional life. They were meant to sound like standard corporate jargon, a line from a human resources manual on managing personnel transitions. But I heard them for what they were, the final, crushing blow in a war of attrition I hadn't even realized I was losing until it was too late. My name is Jenna. I'm 34 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, I had been a project coordinator at Redline Dynamics in Seattle for 5 years. 5 years of grinding. 5 years of 12-hour days fueled by lukewarm coffee and the quiet, desperate hope of climbing the ladder. 5 years of meticulously managing client budgets, juggling impossible deadlines, and most importantly, keeping my mouth shut when my manager, Gavin Reed, made his comments. Gavin was my manager, a fact he seemed to believe granted him a set of unspoken privileges. He was a man carved from the smooth, polished marble of corporate ambition, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes and a handshake that always lingered a second too long. In the beginning, his behavior was easy to dismiss, to rationalize away as the awkward attempts of a superior trying to be one of the team. It started with the lingering glances, his eyes tracing the lines of my blouse during meetings as if he were critiquing the stitching. Then came the comments. "That color really brings out your eyes, Jenna," he'd murmur as I passed his office, the words just loud enough for me to hear but quiet enough to be deniable. His excuses to stand too close during meetings became a grotesque ballet I learned to navigate, subtly shifting my weight or creating a barrier with my notepad. I told myself it was harmless office small talk, the kind of casual unprofessionalism my dad had warned me about. "Women in business need thick skin, honey," he'd always said. So I grew mine layer by layer until it was an armor I wore every day. I redirected every personal question, deflected every compliment that felt less like praise and more like an assessment. I kept everything professional, told myself it wasn't worth making waves. I had student loans up to my neck from a master's degree in business administration and was desperate for the steady paycheck Redline provided. Rocking the boat wasn't an option. For the first year, it was almost bearable. Gavin was, in many ways, a good boss. He gave me challenging projects, trusted me with high-stakes clients, and even backed me up when those clients got difficult. He saw my potential, or so I thought. He asked about my career goals, my 5-year plan, and made me feel like he was invested in my future at the company. That belief, that fragile hope, was the currency I used to pay for my silence. The company was expanding, breaking new ground in Las Vegas. New territory, new clients, new opportunities. It was the talk of the office, a current of excitement that ran through every department. I'd been hoping for a promotion, maybe even team lead on the new project. I'd earned it. I'd put in the time, the sweat, the silent endurance. My performance reviews for 4.5 years had been flawless. I was a model employee. I was dedicated. I thought, indispensable. But as the years wore on, the armor grew heavier. The comments became more frequent, the accidental brushes in the hallway less accidental. By year 3, his behavior had escalated. He'd find excuses to touch my shoulder during meetings, a proprietary squeeze that sent a chill down my spine. He'd ask about my dating life, my weekend plans, his questions laced with an intimacy I found revolting. The real shift came when I got engaged to my boyfriend, David. I wore the simple diamond on my left hand, like a shield. I thought it would be a clear, unspoken boundary. I was wrong. Instead of backing off, Gavin's attitude shifted from predatory charm to a cold, biting critique. My performance reviews, once glowing, suddenly had notes about my lack of responsiveness to management directives and issues with collaborative teamwork. He became hypercritical, finding fault in reports that were identical in format to ones he'd praised a month earlier. The engagement didn't last. The constant stress from work, the person I was becoming just to survive it poisoned everything. David and I broke up after 2 years, and somehow, Gavin found out before I'd told anyone at work. His mood improved dramatically. The compliments returned, the lingering looks, the invitations to business discussions over lunch, just the two of us. I developed strategies. I never worked late if he was still in the office. I always kept my door open during our one-on-one meetings. I started bringing coffee from home so I wouldn't have to use the break room, his favorite place to corner people. I thought I was managing the situation. I saw the sympathetic looks from Patricia in accounting, the way Jake from IT would position himself between us at company events. Everyone knew, but no one said anything. That's how these things work in small companies. Everyone sees the rot, but no one wants to be the one to cut it out, lest they get infected themselves. Then came the Las Vegas trip. Instead of a promotion, Gavin called me into his office on a Tuesday morning. The blinds were drawn, casting the room in a dim, conspiratorial light. He was leaning back in his oversized leather chair, a smug look on his face that I'd learned to hate. "Big news, Jenna," he began, steepling his fingers. "We're heading to Vegas to survey the market. Just you and me." My heart sank, but I kept my face a neutral mask. "That's great news, Gavin. When are we leaving?" "Next week. It'll be a quick trip, but we'll need to stay overnight. Survey the market, meet with some potential clients." He smiled that smile, the one that made my skin crawl. "Hotels are booked tight, though. Company budget, you know." He let the words hang in the air, a threat wrapped in the guise of fiscal responsibility. "We'll have to share a room." I stared at him. 5 years of his lingering glances, his comments about my clothes, his excuses to stand too close, it all culminated in this moment. 5 years of me biting my tongue, redirecting, deflecting. 5 years of telling myself it wasn't worth it. But this was different. This was a line I would not let him cross. I had redirected every conversation, kept everything professional, told myself it wasn't worth making waves. But this was a tsunami, and I refused to drown. "That's not going to happen," I said, my voice colder and steadier than I felt. His smile faded, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. "Excuse me?" I said no. I repeated, the words feeling like a liberation. "I'm not sharing a hotel room with you." He sat forward, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "Jenna, I think you're misunderstanding the nature of this assignment. This is business, nothing more," I countered, my own voice firm. "Then we can get separate rooms." "The budget doesn't allow for that," he hissed. "Then I'm not going." We stared at each other across his desk. I could see him processing this, the gears in his mind calculating his next move. In 5 years, I'd never directly refused him anything. I deflected, sure, redirected, but never a flat no. "I see," he said finally, a dangerous calm settling over him. "Well, I suppose I'll have to reconsider your role on this project." It was a clear threat. My career, my future at this company, hung in the balance. But for the first time, I felt a spark of defiance that was stronger than my fear. I nodded, a single, sharp movement, and walked out of his office. My hands were shaking, but I kept my face neutral as I walked back to my desk. I tried to focus on the quarterly reports, but the words blurred. I knew what was coming. The thing about men like Gavin is they don't handle rejection well. They especially don't handle it when it comes from women they think they own. I'd worked for him long enough to know he'd find a way to make me pay for embarrassing him. I just didn't think it would happen so fast. 2 days later, the call came from Human Resources. 2 days later, I was sitting in that same sterile conference room, this time with Sandra from HR, Gavin, and a man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize, who was introduced as Robert Chen from the company's legal department. Sandra, who had always been pleasant, couldn't meet my eyes. "Jenna," she started, her voice rehearsed. "We've received reports about interpersonal conflicts affecting your work performance. Specifically, issues with collaborative teamwork and responsiveness to management directives." I looked at Gavin. He was staring at his hands, playing the part of the reluctant manager forced to discipline a difficult employee. It was a masterpiece of corporate theater. "I see," I said, my voice betraying none of the fury boiling inside me. Could you be more specific about these reports? That's when the lawyer, Robert Chen, spoke for the first time. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Mr. Reed has documented several instances of insubordination and unprofessional behavior, he said, his tone as cold as a morgue slab. Refusing work assignments, challenging management decisions, creating a hostile work environment. Hostile work environment? I repeated, the irony so thick it was suffocating. Yes, Sandra said, finally looking at me, her expression a mixture of pity and corporate duty. We take these matters very seriously. After careful consideration, we've decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately. I sat there for a moment, the words washing over me. 5 years of clean performance reviews, 5 years of hitting deadlines, managing difficult clients, covering for coworkers. And now I was the problem. Your attitude problem is affecting the workplace, Gavin said, finally looking up, a sliver of triumph in his eyes. We need employees who are more cooperative. Cooperative. There it was. The word that meant everything. I understand, I said, my voice still steady. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. The lawyer slid a document across the table. The company is prepared to offer you 2-week severance, he said. Contingent on signing this non-disclosure agreement. Standard practice. I scanned the document. Legal language about not disparaging the company, not discussing the circumstances of my termination, not pursuing legal action. They wanted my silence. They wanted to buy it for the price of 2 weeks' pay. I'll need to review this with my own attorney, I said. Gavin's jaw tightened. The lawyer's professional veneer cracked for a second. That's your right, of course, Chen said smoothly. But the offer expires at close of business today. I nodded, stood up, and shook hands with Sandra. I didn't look at Gavin. Thank you for the opportunity to work here, I said, the corporate platitude tasting like ash in my mouth. I've learned a lot. I walked back to my desk, packed my personal items into a cardboard box, and left the building. I didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't make a scene. I just walked out with my dignity intact. But sitting in my car in the parking lot, the carefully constructed dam of my composure finally broke. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not defeat, not humiliation. Clarity. Gavin thought he'd won. He thought he'd silenced me, gotten rid of a problem employee who wouldn't play along. He had no idea what he'd actually done. He'd freed me from needing this job. And that changed everything. I drove home and made myself coffee. Then I sat at my kitchen table and started planning. I didn't sign their non-disclosure agreement. Instead, I called David's sister, Lauren. She'd graduated from law school 2 years earlier and worked for a powerhouse firm downtown. She was sharp, tenacious, and had always seen right through Gavin. They're trying to buy your silence, she said after I recounted the meeting. 2-week severance for 5 years of employment? That's insulting. What are my options? I asked, my voice raw. You could file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Sexual harassment, retaliation, wrongful termination. But you'd need documentation. Do you have anything in writing? I thought of the years of veiled comments, the conversations that always happened behind closed doors. No, I said, my stomach sinking. It was all verbal. Okay, Lauren said, her tone all business. This will be harder, but not impossible. Let me make some calls. That's when Gavin made his biggest mistake. The next day, Robert Chen called my personal cell. Jenna, this is Robert Chen from Redline Dynamics. I understand you've been in contact with outside legal counsel regarding your termination. I want to be very clear about something. The non-disclosure agreement you refused to sign contained important protections for both parties. Without those protections, we may be forced to take a more aggressive stance. Meaning what, exactly? I asked. Meaning we have documentation of performance issues dating back 2 years. Missed deadlines, client complaints, insubordination. If this matter proceeds to litigation, we'll be forced to present evidence that your termination was entirely justified and had nothing to do with any alleged harassment. I felt my stomach clench. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining the legal realities of your situation, he said, his voice slick with condescension. The offer stands until the end of business today. 2 weeks severance, mutual non-disclosure. A clean separation. After today, any settlement discussions would necessarily be less favorable. He hung up before I could respond. I called Lauren immediately. They're threatening to fabricate performance issues, I said, my voice shaking with rage. They can't do that, can they? They can try, she said grimly. But you have 5 years of performance reviews, right? A clean record. Up until this year, I admitted. Gavin gave me 2 negative reviews after I started refusing his invitations. When exactly did those negative reviews start? I pulled up my email archives. March and June. Right after I told him I wasn't interested in having dinner with him. Perfect, Lauren said. That's textbook retaliation. The timing alone proves your case. But when I went to my email the next morning, something was wrong. My work account had been deactivated, which was expected, but my personal emails from colleagues were gone. Messages I'd forwarded to my personal account, backup copies of documents, performance reviews I'd saved, everything related to Redline Dynamics had vanished. I called my internet provider. There was a legal request for data removal, the technician told me. A court order. They had to comply. What court order? I demanded. You need to contact the requesting party for details, he said, and the line went dead. I called Lauren in a panic. They've deleted everything. All my evidence. That's not possible. You can't just delete someone's personal emails. They did it somehow, she said, a grim silence on the other end of the line. Jenna, who exactly are we dealing with here? How big is this company? I looked up Redline Dynamics corporate structure online. What I found made my blood run cold. They weren't just a logistics company. They were a subsidiary of a much larger defense contractor. Government connections, military contracts. The kind of company that probably had lawyers who knew exactly how to make problems disappear. I spent 3 days in my apartment feeling defeated. Every avenue seemed blocked. My evidence was gone. My EEOC complaint looked weak without documentation, and Redline's lawyers had made it clear they'd fight dirty. But Wednesday evening, something unexpected happened. My doorbell rang. Patricia from accounting stood on my doorstep, looking nervous. I hope you don't mind me coming by, she said, wringing her hands. I got your address from the employee directory before they updated it. I invited her in, made coffee, and waited for her to speak. I heard what happened, she said finally. About the Vegas trip, about your termination. I wanted you to know you're not the first. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. What do you mean? 3 years ago, there was another woman, Kelly Morrison. She worked in client relations. Same thing happened to her. Gavin made advances, she refused, and suddenly she was terminated for performance issues. What happened to her? I whispered. She tried to fight it, filed complaints, hired a lawyer. The company buried her in legal motions until she ran out of money. She eventually took a settlement, just to make it stop. Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. But she kept copies of everything. Every email, every performance review, every interaction with Gavin. She then reached in again and pulled out a worn manila folder. And I've been keeping records too. Every time I've seen Gavin behave inappropriately, every conversation I've overheard. I never knew what to do with the information, but I couldn't just ignore what was happening. She handed me the folder. I knew someday someone would need proof. I just didn't have the financial stability to be that someone myself. By Friday, we had statements from 9 women spanning 6 years. Lauren introduced me to her firm's senior partner, a woman named Margaret Walsh who specialized in employment law. Margaret had silver hair and steel in her voice, the kind of lawyer corporations actually feared. I've seen companies like Redline before, she told me during our first meeting. Defense contractors with government connections think they're untouchable. But sexual harassment law doesn't care about your security clearance. We developed a strategy. First, file an amended EEOC complaint with Kelly's and Patricia's evidence. Second, reach out to the local media. Margaret had contacts at the Seattle Times who covered workplace issues. Third, identify other potential victims through social media and professional networks. The key is momentum, Margaret explained. Once the first story breaks, other women will come forward. They always do. But we need to move carefully. Redline has already demonstrated their willingness to play dirty, and we can't afford to give them any ammunition. Margaret filed the amended complaint Monday morning. Tuesday, the Seattle Times published their investigation. The headline read, "Defense Contractor Faces Multiple Harassment Allegations." The story laid out the pattern of behavior, the company's responses, and the broader implications for workplace culture in the defense industry. Redline stock price dropped 12% by market close. Wednesday morning, my phone rang. It was Robertson again. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "I think we may have been hasty in our previous communications. My client is prepared to discuss a reasonable settlement that addresses your concerns." "What kind of settlement?" I asked, my voice cool. "Full salary compensation for 12 months, positive references, and a contribution to a women's workplace advocacy organization of your choosing, in exchange for standard non-disclosure terms." "What about the other women?" "That would need to be discussed separately," he said quickly. I hung up and called Margaret. "They're trying to isolate me from the group," I said. "Classic divide and conquer," she replied. "They want to silence you before more women come forward." "How many calls have you gotten from reporters?" 15 since yesterday." "Good. The pressure's working. Don't take any interviews yet, but let them know you're represented by counsel and considering all options." Thursday brought another development. The Department of Defense announced they were reviewing Redline's government contracts in light of the harassment allegations. For a company that derived 60% of its revenue from federal contracts, this was devastating. Friday afternoon, Margaret called with news. Redline's board of directors held an emergency meeting. Gavin Reed has been terminated, effective immediately. They've also agreed to establish a $10 million fund for workplace harassment prevention and victim compensation. "What about the other women?" I asked. "They'll all be offered settlements based on their individual circumstances. And the company has agreed to independent oversight of their human resources practices for the next 5 years." I sat in my kitchen, staring out the window. 2 weeks ago, I'd been terminated for refusing to share a hotel room with my boss. Now, he was the one out of a job. But there was still one more call I needed to make. Saturday evening, 7:30 p.m., I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and my phone. I'd been thinking about this call for weeks. Not because I wanted revenge, exactly, but because there was someone who deserved to know the truth. Cynthia Reed answered on the third ring. "Hello. Mrs. Reed, this is Jenna Whitmore. I used to work for your husband at Redline Dynamics." Silence. Then, "I heard about the news stories." "I imagine you did," I said. "I'm calling because I thought you should know that this wasn't just about work. The harassment wasn't just professional misconduct." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice small. I took a breath. "He told me several times that his marriage was ending, that he was planning to leave you. He said you didn't understand him, that you'd grown apart. He used that as justification for pursuing other women." More silence. "He's been telling women for years that his marriage was basically over," I continued, "that he was just waiting for the right time to file for divorce. I thought you should know that." "How many women?" she finally whispered. "At least 9 that we've documented. Probably more." Cynthia was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Harder. "Thank you for calling. I need to ask you something. Do you have any evidence of him discussing our marriage with you or the other women?" "Text messages, voice recordings," I said. and several of the other women received similar communications. Would you be willing to share those with my attorney? Of course. Good, she said, her voice like flint, because I filed for separation this morning. And now I'm filing for divorce, on grounds of adultery and emotional abuse. 3 months later, I started my new job at Brightcrest Analytics, a mid-sized consulting firm in downtown Seattle. Better salary, better benefits, and a female CEO who'd specifically recruited me after reading about the Redline case. The settlement money allowed me to take my time finding the right position. I'd turned down several offers from larger companies that felt too much like my old job. I wanted something different, somewhere I could rebuild my career on my own terms. Gavin's divorce was finalized in February. Cynthia got the house, half his retirement fund, and full custody of their teenage daughter. The recordings I'd provided had helped establish a pattern of deception and emotional manipulation that extended far beyond his workplace behavior. He moved to Phoenix and took a job with a small construction company. No management responsibilities, no female subordinates. His new employer had done their homework. Kelly Morrison reached out last month to tell me she'd been hired by a nonprofit that advocates for workplace harassment victims. She was using her settlement money to fund their legal assistance program. Patricia got promoted to accounting manager at Redline after Gavin's departure. The new department head was a woman who'd been brought in specifically to rebuild the company culture. I kept the flash drive Patricia had given me. Sometimes I'd look at it and remember how alone I'd felt that Tuesday morning when Human Resources called me downstairs. I'd thought I was fighting by myself, against an entire system designed to protect men like Gavin. But I wasn't alone. None of us were. The women who came before me had been documenting, recording, and waiting for someone to take the first step. When I finally spoke up, they were ready. Sometimes justice takes time, but it's worth waiting for.